During Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht achieved many spectacular operational successes, inflicting massive losses on the Red Army. But this does not mean the Red Army fought poorly. They indeed suffered enormous casualties, but they fought tenaciously and inflicted heavy losses on the Germans as well, which is rarely discussed. The common perception of Operation Barbarossa in its initial phase, roughly the first 3 months, from June 22, 1941, to the end of September, is one of uninterrupted German victories. The Red Army lost tens of thousands of artillery pieces and mortars, countless tanks and aircraft, millions of prisoners, and hundreds of thousands killed. Hitler's army pushed forward relentlessly. Even after the fall of the Soviet Union, some historians suggested that the Red Army sometimes offered weak resistance, that commissars were executed, units panicked, abandoned weapons, or even defected to the Germans. However, as discussed in previous episodes such as the Battle of Kiev in August 1941 or the fight for Przemysl in June 1941, this view of a poorly fighting Red Army in 1941 is highly inaccurate. What lies behind the idea that the Red Army fought poorly? In terms of capabilities compared to the Wehrmacht, the Red Army was indeed less well commanded, often rigid and inflexible, poorly coordinated, but tough. While their tactics were primitive and unsophisticated, they fought fiercely. Cases of defection existed, but statistically, they were exceptions. Soviet soldiers may have lacked finesse, but they were extremely difficult opponents who, under proper command, fought stubbornly. The German army did achieve victories, but at a very high cost. We must remember that in the summer of 1941, two enormous armies collided. Reading reports, memoirs, and accounts from German soldiers during the first 3 days of the war, many emphasized the fanatical resistance of their opponent. While there were surrenders, there were also desperate fights to the last soldier, the last bunker crew, the last tank crew. Therefore, we should not hastily conclude that Operation Barbarossa in summer 1941 was a walk in the park for the Wehrmacht. On June 22, 1941, two giant armies clashed. Hitler deployed 3.3 million soldiers against roughly 2.5 million in the Red Army's operational zones. Never before, in the Polish campaign or the French campaign, had such massive forces been assembled. These colossal armies meant staggering casualties on both sides. In the first month, the German army shattered parts of the front, particularly in the Bialystok-Belarus sector. Army Group Center under Fedor von Bock, advancing from Mazovia and Podlasie through Bialystok and Belarus, reached the Smolensk Gate in just 30 days, encircling two pockets where over 600,000 Soviet soldiers ultimately surrendered. Hundreds of thousands more were killed, wounded, or went missing, many taking to the forests to continue irregular partisan warfare. Meanwhile, Army Group North under von Lieb advanced in the Baltic states, covering half the distance to Leningrad in just a month, while Army Group South under von Rundstedt faced the largest concentration of Red Army forces but still pushed them back toward the Dnieper and Kiev by the end of June. German reports from the first month noted that the enemy suffered colossal losses. However, far fewer realized that the Wehrmacht paid a tremendous price for these victories. German soldiers were shocked. They were unprepared for the scale of effort required to defeat the Red Army. Over 3 million Germans faced over 2 million Soviets, with thousands of tanks, planes, artillery, and mortars on both sides. From the very start, Germany realized this campaign was different from previous wars. This was no war like Poland in 1939, France in 1940, or the British in North Africa. The opponent was completely different, and so were the Germans themselves. They disregarded the rights of Soviet soldiers. The uniqueness of this war lies in both technical and mental factors. Technically, the Red Army possessed more tanks, aircraft, artillery, mortars, and machine guns than any previous opponent of the Wehrmacht. Soviet units could concentrate larger numbers of weapons on selected sectors than the Germans. And even after destroying thousands of planes, German pilots faced continuous waves of Soviet bombers from the many airfields the Soviets held. Mentally, many Soviet units fought to the last man, or as long as officers were present. The Germans expected that the shock of war and Stalinist repression would collapse the Red Army immediately, but they were gravely mistaken. Indoctrination, oversight, fear of Stalin, and fear of communism drove hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers to resist fiercely, often more than fear of the Germans themselves. Soviet units often conducted poorly coordinated tank or infantry attacks, yet still inflicted massive losses on the Germans. The Wehrmacht had never fought against an enemy with such a concentration of weaponry. From June 22 onward, they faced a mechanized colossus. German soldiers were more skilled, but the scale and intensity of Soviet resistance was overwhelming. The mental factor also played a role: fanaticism and stubbornness. German reports noted that Soviet units often killed German prisoners rather than surrendering when out of ammunition. For example, near Broniki Kluin, the 25th Infantry Division reported that an entire company surrendered, but when Germans took control on July 2nd, all 120 soldiers were found dead, mutilated. By June 1941, the Red Army's 2.5 million soldiers, supported by 12,000 tanks, inflicted staggering material losses on the Germans, who were unprepared for such casualties. Chief of Staff Franz Halder had expected 250–300,000 German casualties during the decisive phase of Barbarossa, but losses were 6 times higher. In just the first 9 days, Germany lost 40,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. By July, casualties across the Eastern Front exceeded 150,000, with August reaching nearly 200,000, and September about 140,000. In short, by the end of September 1941, the German army, despite spectacular victories at Bialystok, Smolensk, Kiev, Kharkiv, and approaching Leningrad, had paid a cost of over 550,000 casualties. This also amounts to 50,000 German soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. 500,000 German soldiers were eliminated from combat during a period when, by all appearances, the German army was victorious and advancing. This was a bloodletting the Wehrmacht could not replenish. The Germans maintained specific statistics, showing how much they were losing their potential. There was the so-called cumulative losses. Reports on cumulative losses showed 41,000 soldiers in June on the Eastern Front, over 200,000 including July, over 400,000 including August, 550,000 including September, 664,000 by the end of October, 750,000 by the end of November, and 830,000 by the end of December. In other words, in half a year, the German army lost 1 million soldiers in combat. 1 in 3 German soldiers who crossed the border on June 22, 1941. Statistically, considering rotations and new forces, by September 1941 was already dead, wounded, captured, or missing. Of course, the Red Army suffered far greater losses. Over 3 million prisoners were taken by the Germans in 1941. We must also note that the largest encirclements, the highest number of prisoners, were in September and October 1941, i.e., in the second autumn period of fighting, specifically the Kiev encirclement and the largest Jasonbronsk encirclement. In these 2 pockets, over 1.2 million prisoners were captured. Meanwhile, the Wehrmacht lost far fewer soldiers than they eliminated from the opponent. But that does not change the fact that they suffered enormous losses, and all these victories achieved in June, July, August, and September 1941 were in a way like Pyrrhic victories. The concept of a Pyrrhic victory refers to the wars in ancient times, even before the Common Era, of King Pyrrhus of Epirus against the early Roman Republic. Pyrrhus defeated the Romans in Italy but suffered immense losses himself, giving rise to the phrase attributed to him, "Another such victory and we are undone." The Germans were exhausting themselves while advancing east. Was the German replacement system, the logistics system, prepared for such losses? No, the German army was not prepared for such high casualties. Regardless of logistics, which will be covered in a separate episode, there were no reserves capable of replacing losses quickly. Let's refer to the notes of the Chief of the German Army General Staff, General Halder. Halder recorded that between June 22, 1941, and August 31st, so, in just over 2 months, the German army had 87,000 killed, 300,000 wounded, and 20,000 missing, totaling over 400,000 soldiers. During the same period, replacements that arrived at the army in the east numbered 217,000. Another 100,000 were announced but had not yet reached the front. In other words, between June and August, Germany lost 400,000 soldiers while receiving only 217,000 replacements, about half of the losses. The further they advanced east, the weaker they became. Space and time played to the advantage of the Red Army. Despite literally slaughtering Red Army soldiers, the Germans were paying too high a price in blood for their capabilities. This applied to both soldiers and equipment. According to the report of September 4, 1941, 30% of all German tanks were completely eliminated from combat, 23% were under repair, and only 47% remained combat ready. In other words, by the end of August 1941, Germany had lost in one way or another half of the tanks they began the campaign with. There were problems repairing those sent to maintenance, as the German industry could not simultaneously produce enough spare parts for already produced tanks and new tanks. A debate arose about whether parts from tanks in Germany should be removed and sent as spare parts to tanks at the Eastern Front, but Hitler decided against it. Consequently, the advancing Wehrmacht had fewer tanks, while completed tanks remained in Germany. In 1941 on the Eastern Front, the German army was essentially losing only tanks. Replacements were absolutely inadequate for the losses incurred. The Wehrmacht attacked in June 1941 with about 4,000 tracked armored fighting vehicles, of which about 3,500 were tanks. By November 30, 1941, according to German reports, irrevocable losses were 2,400 tanks, 85 assault guns, and 27 armored infantry vehicles. These are only permanent losses. 2,500 of these 4,000 vehicles were destroyed. In addition, hundreds were under repair but could not be quickly restored due to lack of spare parts. In other words, the German army, which attacked in mid-1941 with about 4,000 tracked combat vehicles, lost by the end of the year about 2,800 vehicles permanently, with several hundred more under repair. This meant that by December 1941, the German armored forces on the Eastern Front were only a shadow of their former strength. This can be clearly traced in the reports of the 2 Panzer Army, formerly the 2 Panzer Group, under Colonel General Heinz Guderian. By the end of 1941, the 2 Panzer Army consisted primarily of the 3 IV, 17, and 18 Panzer divisions. According to reports at the end of the year, these 4 divisions, of which the 3 and IV were elite German divisions, had 980 tanks on June 22 in their armored regiments. By November 1, 1941, they still had 980 tanks. However, throughout the Barbarossa campaign from June to December 1941, these 4 Panzer divisions received 167 replacement tanks. Of the remaining tanks, some were under repair and therefore non-operational. As a result, Guderian's 2 Panzer Army had 415 tanks by November 1, half of what it had at the start, but only 210 were combat ready. By December 1, 1941, only 105 tanks were combat ready in those 4 divisions. Compare the numbers. June 22 to 980 tanks in 4 divisions, December 1 to 105. Thus, the combat potential of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group Army declined tenfold over 6 months in terms of tanks. A similar situation prevailed in all German panzer groups. Over 6 months, they were completely exhausted. When did the Germans realize that the campaign was turning into a Pyrrhic victory? General Halder discovered this on August 11, 1941, when Barbarossa had not even lasted 2 months. Halder wrote, regarding the general situation, "It is increasingly clear that we underestimated the Russian colossus, which consciously prepared for war with an absolute, ruthless totalitarian state. This applies to their organizational and economic potential, transportation management, and, above all, purely military strength. At the start of the war, we counted on 200 enemy divisions. To date, we have identified 360. They are not divisions equipped or armed in our understanding of these words, and tactically the Russians command them clumsily in many respects. But these divisions exist, and when we destroy 10 of them, the Russians replace them with 10 more. Time works in their favor, as they are close to their centers of power, while we move ever further from ours. Our troops, stretched along an extremely long front with no depth, are subjected to continuous enemy attacks. Sometimes these attacks succeed, because on such vast spaces too many gaps remain by default. This perhaps more than anything shows Halder's astonishment at the enemy's strength rather than the exhaustion of our own forces, though he also focused intensely on that. What worried Halder most was not that replacements did not keep up with losses. They were at a 1-to-2 ratio, but that officer casualties were enormous. 15,000 officers lost, while only 5,000 officers could be trained, meaning the shortage was 3 times greater than replacements. This haunted Halder. The best German soldiers, the experienced ones from 1939 to 41, were dying, and officer corps losses could not be replaced as quickly as those of ordinary soldiers. Halder realized that combat capabilities were being exhausted because the Red Army fought hard. Halder wrote to his wife at the end of July 1941 about Hitler, noting his absurd ideas, endless questioning of what had been achieved, and his obsession that only he knew how to wage war. Halder described being on the verge of despair, seeing the consequences of nonsense, relying on his faith and self-confidence to avoid breaking down. By late July, the atmosphere in the German Army General Staff was tense due to how Operation Barbarossa was unfolding. It was simultaneously going well and badly, even very badly. Germans emphasized that Red Army resistance exceeded expectations. The Red soldier did not fight like a Polish or French soldier, as Halder noted. They would not surrender easily. Each had to be killed. Did the 3 million prisoners contradict this resistance? No. Tens of thousands of Red Army soldiers did not surrender but escaped into forests, beginning partisan warfare. The Smolensk pocket in July 1941 took another 310,000 prisoners, but only after heavy fighting. In 1941, the truly large Eastern Front pockets were in the fall: Kiev, Vyazma, Bryansk. In the September to October encirclements, the Germans captured half of all the prisoners they took in 1941. The June to July pockets were exhausting for the Red Army but not decisive. The Red Army had operational depth, with 3 layers. Destroying one group did not open the front. Von Bock, advancing with Army Group Center in June to July 1941, reached Smolensk in a month and twice destroyed Red Army units in front of him. After destroying the second formation, he still faced a third group of infantry divisions, while armored units were separated from infantry divisions, which negatively affected operational capabilities. The Germans saw that the opponent was putting up stronger resistance in the sense that he was inflicting too heavy losses on the attackers. By the end of August 1941, the Germans had recorded the loss of over 400,000 of their soldiers, including 87,000 killed. This was more than all previous campaigns combined. Indeed, earlier, in terms of the number of killed, the Red Army in June 1941 killed more Germans in 9 days than the Polish Army did during the entire 1939 campaign. And the losses in July's battles did not see as many Germans killed even at Stalingrad. When we look at the statistics of German losses, in 1941, over 6 months, the Wehrmacht lost more soldiers than in the entire year of 1942. In 1942, over 12 months, the Germans lost about 1 million soldiers on the Eastern Front. They also lost 1 million in 1941 over 6 months. The battles in 1941, victorious in the offensive, were for the Germans twice as bloody as later on the front in 1942. Even the offensive on the Southern Front in 1942 did not result in such losses. In 1942 and 1943, the Germans did not suffer losses like those in 1941. It was costly for them, especially because in 1941 the cream of their army was dying. The best soldiers, most motivated, trained even before the war, highly indoctrinated, officers, non-commissioned officers, and soldiers who wanted to fight. This colossus of the Eastern Front devoured all of them. Are you saying that these losses in the first half of the war, this stiff resistance of the Red Army, forced the Wehrmacht in the following years to conduct operations that were in a sense limited in scope, no longer across the entire front as they did in 1941? This is primarily a matter of resources, because the Wehrmacht was constantly growing. In 1939, when Hitler started the war, he had 100 divisions. When he attacked Stalin in 1941, he already had 200 divisions. Later, the Wehrmacht would grow even to 300 divisions. However, in terms of material, nothing could compare to this exhaustion, this consumption of resources in 1941, but we are talking about a certain scale. Of course, in 1944, the Wehrmacht would fire more rounds on the Eastern Front than in 1941. Its opponent would also be even larger, because the Red Army, almost destroyed in 1941, would gradually rebuild and then grow. The point is that in the summer of 1941, the Germans realized that they could conduct a campaign on three directions: Leningrad, Kiev, Moscow, only for a few months, and they were no longer capable of such operations. We discussed this in the episode on ROP. 3 months. July, August, and September. The Germans consumed 1 million tons of gasoline on the Eastern Front, which was their entire annual production, and later they were no longer able to generate similar consumption, neither in 1942 nor in 1943. The Wehrmacht never had such consumption again. In short, the summer of 1941 was a true clash of titans, but it was not a clash where the mighty Wehrmacht crushed the Red Army effortlessly. And after what happened in the summer, paradoxically, in the autumn there came a calm. What can one think by saying calm? Many often think that the Red Army stopped the Wehrmacht at Moscow, launched a counterattack, that the Battle of Moscow was a decisive fight, and so on. In reality, in November 1941, the Germans had 87,000 casualties, and in December 77,000 combat losses. In December 1941, during the Battle of Moscow, German losses were already the fight of weakened players. It was already a fight of shadows. In December and November 1941, Guderian had 100 tanks instead of 1,000. The Russians had similarly small forces. They were fighting each other with very small numbers compared to the battles of summer 1941. So you mean there were simply fewer soldiers on the front on both sides due to the losses suffered? Exactly. It was simply watching a boxing match. Summer 1941 was the first, second, third round, two strong fighters full of energy and testosterone fighting. December 1941 was the 12th round, two exhausted, beaten fighters barely standing. In short, of the 1 million German soldiers in 1941, most were lost in the summer. Of course, to be clear, in November, December, and January 1942, besides combat losses, killed, wounded, missing, there were very high statistics of frostbite. So losses, though no longer combat losses, remained high, but combat losses were incomparably smaller than in the summer. By August 1941, the Germans, as Halder's quotes show, realized that they had bitten off more than they could chew. They would not be able to fight the Red Army and could not sustain the rate of losses they were suffering, and this rate of losses resulted from the pace of their offensive. From the autumn of 1941, the pace of combat, especially from mid-October after the first strike of Operation Typhoon, began to slow. From October and November 1941, it was a different war. The Red Army managed to weaken and wound the Wehrmacht internally so that it was exhausted. Suddenly it turned out that there was no recovery. The Germans had been running hard for 3 months and were exhausted. So, if I understand correctly, the image that emerges is that it was not General Winter who stopped the Wehrmacht? Yes, exactly. The impact of General Winter, or even Marshal Mudd, on the final outcome of the operation is often greatly exaggerated. The key factor in the German failure was the inability to regenerate forces, the inability to restore the weakened organism. This organism was weakened by the murderous fight with the Red Army. The Russians often suffered losses at a ratio of 5 to 7 to 1, but still inflicted losses on the German army that it could not replenish in the short term. Emphasize the phrase, in the short term. But that was precisely the point of Barbarossa. It was meant to be a short, several-month campaign. And the Germans knew from the start that if they did not defeat the Red Army within a few months, they would not win, and they did not. Look at the Luftwaffe, from September 1st, 1939 to June 21st, 1941, bombing Poland, Belgium, France, fighting the Battle of Britain, fighting in the Balkans, crushing Yugoslavia, Greece, and so on. It lost 6,700 aircraft in combat. Meanwhile, in the next 6 months on the Eastern Front, it lost 2,500 aircraft. The Luftwaffe had relatively small human losses, about 13,000 soldiers. Of these 13,000 permanently eliminated Luftwaffe personnel in the East, 3,231 were killed and 2,000 missing. 5,000 were more than the Luftwaffe could train in a year. Halder worried that he had lost 15,000 officers, while only 5,000 new ones could be trained. Goering had it much worse because, as the famous book The Officer Factory describes, replacing 5,000 lost crews experienced veterans from over England and France, was practically impossible. Especially since he was already dealing with fuel shortages, the Luftwaffe in 1941 flew at 300% of fuel norms on the Eastern Front. Goering moved east with about 2,500 combat aircraft. By November, there were still 2,000 combat aircraft on the Eastern Front. In December, only 1,500. Just as Guderian ran out of tanks, the Luftwaffe began to run out of aircraft. As a result, in July and August, they could carry out massive raids. In November and December, Soviet aviation dominated the skies over the Eastern Front. In December 1941, the Germans had not even 500 bombers across the entire Eastern Front. Such modest forces could not conduct effective offensive operations. In 1941, as we know, there was a rout of Soviet aviation, but the Luftwaffe lost 407 aircraft in 9 days over Poland in just over a month. Losses were almost twice as small. In July, the Luftwaffe lost 715 aircraft. Imagine General Halder, but above all Marshal Keitel and General Jodl, who at the end of July 1941 received statistics showing that half of the tanks were non-operational. The Army had lost 200,000 soldiers, and the Luftwaffe had lost over 1,000 aircraft. There had been no such reports in 1939 or 1940. It could not be compared with the French campaign, especially regarding killed soldiers. By the end of July, they were in a corner. This entire dispute, Moscow or Kiev, stemmed from desperation. By the end of July 1941, the Germans realized that they would not complete the operational plans of Barbarossa. It was impossible due to space, time, and the strength of the opponent's resistance. They began to look for a last hope, an operation that would allow them to defeat the opponent with limited resources. Halder and von Bock insisted that the entire effort should be concentrated on striking Moscow. If one could not defeat the opponent in a war of attrition in one decisive battle, because he kept recovering like a hydra, cut off one head and two grew in its place, they had to strike the heart, paralyze the brain, capture Moscow, and attempt to collapse the system. Generals were seeking a solution in a single strike. Halder and General Brochich were ready to take replacements in the logistical system of Army Group North and Army Group South and give everything to von Bock so that he could advance from Smolensk to Moscow, only 400 kilometers. But this required strategic decisions, and a dispute arose between Hitler and his generals and marshals, Moscow or Kiev. Hitler ultimately chose Kiev. He realized that the war in 1941 might not end and might have to be thought of in economic terms, that Ukraine's grain was needed. Kiev would provide open access to the Caucasus and oil-rich Baku. Therefore, Hitler abandoned the German concept of a decisive battle after 1.5 months of the war in favor of seeking long-term solutions. This determined not only the outcome of the Battle of Kiev in September 1941, but also the entire Fall-Blau operation in 1942, and consequently Stalingrad. Hitler realized that he could not conduct a decisive battle with the Wehrmacht for longer than 3 months without almost bleeding it to death. Hence, the Germans began to ease off. The turning point in this dispute was that the generals sought a decisive battle. They wanted a decisive battle, a war of annihilation. They aimed to meet the bulk of the enemy at point X, fight a gargantuan battle, and crush him. That was the traditional approach of German, Prussian marshals and generals. They always aimed for decisive battle. Hitler, however, was frightened by the level of losses. July and August 1941 to 400,000 eliminated from combat, 90,000 killed, 20,000 missing German soldiers. With no previous comparison, caused Hitler to redirect the war from a goal of decisive battle at Moscow to a war of attrition, to an economic war. Could this slaughter win an economic war? Probably not, and so, already in summer 1941, the German generals realized that it was probably the end, that the war would last many more years. But as Halder wrote to his wife, the outcome seemed obvious. I hope that in this episode, by citing all these numbers on German losses, we have shown that the common opinion of weak and ineffective Soviet resistance in summer 1941 is completely wrong. Yes, it is completely false. The Red Army in summer 1941 put up such stiff resistance that it bled the Wehrmacht. The Germans won, but these were Pyrrhic victories. Hitler realized in September 1941 that a few more such victories and no German would remain alive.